call the special called meeting of the County Council of Monday, August 21st to order. We look around the room. We do have all but Mr. York Glover in attendance. Therefore, we can take any actions as necessary. Would you all rise for the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Public notice of this meeting has been published, posted, and distributed in compliance with the South Carolina Freedom of Information Act. I need a member to offer a motion and second for the approval of tonight's agenda.
So moved, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Cunningham made the motion. Mr. Bartholomew made the second, duly motioned and seconded. Any discussion? Seeing no discussion, the agenda will be approved without any objections, and there are none. We are at citizen comments. Is there any member of the audience who wishes to make a comment at this time? Seeing none, we will move on to our action items. We have a motion for the second reading of an ordinance amendment to provide for a modified millage rate for the levy of tax for school purposes for Beaufort County for the fiscal year beginning July 1, 2023, ending June 30th, 2024, and to make appropriations for said purposes. May I have a motion for that?
I'll make the motion.
Okay.
I'll second it.
Ms. Tabernick made the motion, Ms. Howard made the second, duly motioned and seconded. Is there any discussion?
Can I just make a comment, Mr.
Yes,
Chair?
ma'am.
I want to recognize that Tanya Crosby, the CFO of the school district, is here, just to make sure it goes through.
Yes,
And so she's here. I want to recognize that, as this is our second reading.
yes, this is the second reading. Any other further discussion?
It lowered the millage, I believe, correct?
Yes, it did lower the millage, which is a wonderful thing.
3.1 mils.
We have one final reading that will take place next week. Any other discussion? Seeing none, the second reading will be approved without objection, and I see no objections. Next, we have an executive session. I will ask a member of council to move in second for the following executive session items. Under South Carolina Code 30-470A1 and A2. Item number 7 is a discussion of employment of a person regulated by County Council, Mr. John Robinson. Item number 8 is to receive legal advice on matters covered by the attorney-client privilege, retention of an outside law firm to conduct reviews and audits as previously approved by council. And item number 9 is pursuant to South Carolina Code Section 349A2 to receive legal advice on matters covered by the attorney-client privilege, Eric Greenway's request for a public hearing pursuant to South Carolina Code Section 4-9-620.
So moved, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Cunningham makes the motion.
Second that.
Ms. Brown makes the second, duly motioned and second. Any discussion? Seeing no discussion, we are now in executive session. There may or may not be matters arising out of executive session.
We can leave our stuff.
Yeah, you can leave your stuff here. This is not going to take very long.
Fort Fremont closes out a 350-year legacy of coastal fortifications in Port Royal Sound, beginning in the mid-16th century. It also represents the closing chapter of America's coastal defense system before the dawn of air power. Fort Fremont is an example of the most advanced military technology of its time. It would parallel the B-17, an aircraft carrier of World War II, the F-35 of today. Fort Fremont was an important part of the Beaufort culture, very similar to Parris Island and the Marine Corps Air Base today.
In 1525, the Spaniards named this sound and this harbor Santa Elena. They called the navigational point La Punta de Santa Elena, the point of Santa Elena. And what the Spanish explorers discovered is that Port Royal Sound is a unique piece of geography. It's the deepest natural harbor south of the Chesapeake Bay, possibly south of New York. The channel into Port Royal Sound, this I find a remarkable geological fact. The channel has not changed for 500 years. There's no inlet on the southern coast that hasn't shifted entirely in 500 years, except Port Royal Sound. There's something geologically different, or one might say magical, about Port Royal Sound. So Spanish sailors, being the best in the world in their time, found this place very early, knew that for the Spanish explorations of the American Southeast, this would be the entrada, the entrance. And so they built a city across the river, across the sound from where we are on Parris Island. It became the first capital of Florida. And they explored the backcountry from this location for more than a century with the object of building a highway from this magnificent harbor to Mexico City. So the Sound was known to the Spaniards. It was known to the French, who actually got here first and created the first Protestant colony in the New World on Parris Island over my shoulder. And that colony was a failure. The Spaniards replaced them. It was part of Spanish Florida when the English arrived 150 years later. And this became, as a consequence, a battleground in the 18th century between Spanish interests in Florida and St. Augustine and the English colony in Carolina and in Charleston. And back and forth these wars went, many of them naval wars, many of them employing, as all the sailors knew by then, the magic of Port Royal Sound. When the Civil War came, Confederates defended the harbor, but it was basically indefensible against large naval forces. So the U.S. Navy made it their principal target during the beginning of the Civil War and sent the largest flotilla of ships assembled by the United States Navy in the 19th century into Port Royal Sound on November 7th, 1861. In a 4-hour cannonade, which would have been deafening from where we're sitting, was heard for miles from Savannah nearly to Charleston. It was called the Day of the Big Gun Shoot. During the Civil War, this harbor that we're looking at was filled with ships. There would be hundreds of ships in this harbor. There was a 1,000-foot dock with a railroad on top off of Hilton Head. The military installation was mammoth. There were 13,000 U.S. soldiers on Hilton Head, which we're looking at. The largest population on Hilton Head until 1974. So this was a major U.S. government installation in the heart of the South. It was the headquarters of the U.S. Army Department of the South, but more importantly, it was the headquarters of the United States Navy South Atlantic Blockading Squadron. So the biggest ships in the Navy were here. And so it became, and that's really where the story of Fort Fremont starts, with that huge Civil War military operations and installations on Hilton Head, on St. Helena Island, on Parris Island, and in Beaufort.
After the Civil War, we're going to see a massive change in technology that's going to revolutionize the military. During the Civil War, we had ironclad ships, we had rifled cannons, but they were all made out of iron, and they were not terribly effective. But its technology is going to change after the Civil War. We're going to see steel produced, and steel is much harder. So now we have a new material to make armor out of for ships. So we can have these armored ships made with steel that are much more resistant to shot. Because I have steel, I can make stronger barrels for my guns. I can rifle and machine these much better, and the rifling is the spirals that are cut in the barrel that allows it to shoot further with more accuracy. And we can also now have breech loading guns that can lock from behind, so I can load my gun from behind. I don't have to go have the old black powder muzzle loading cannon that I had before. Now I can fire much more rapidly. If I compare the gun of 1890 to the guns of 1860, for the same caliber, the same diameter gun, the 1890 gun will be able to fire a projectile that's 4 times heavier, can shoot it 3 times further, can put it in with greater precision, and can put it through much more armor than anything we had in the 1860s. It's a world difference. A military historian, E.R. Lewis, would say that the change between the Civil War and 1890 in artillery technology was the greatest that would be seen since the invention of artillery in the 14th century to the introduction of the nuclear projectile in the 1950s. So there's been a huge change in gun technology. At the same time, it's not just the steel, but also the powder that fires these guns is different. We're having new chemical makeup, and sort of like cordite is invented now, and it's still a widely used military explosive even today. Smokeless powder is invented during this period of time. And it's not just chemical composition, but it's the details of how you make the grain, how fast they burn. So much like the skill of firing a solid rocket, solid fuel rocket, it's that same kind of technology that's been developed in these gunpowder and this new powder. So our weapons of this day are much, much greater. They would be the great killing machines of World War I. Most of the casualties on the battlefields of World War I would come from artillery. So the world has seen a huge change in artillery, and that's tied into changes in ships. We now have steel armored ships. They're all steam powered. They are now equipped with these fine long-range guns, and they now become the dominant threat of the late 19th, early 20th century. This is the threat. The French and the English would bombard cities like Cairo and reduce them to rubble because they were unable to defend them. So this is how the world was seeing the threat from this new technology. Big battleships are the threat of the era, and new guns and fortifications on the ground are what you have to defend against them.
One of the most important and first things that happened after the Civil War is they built a railroad to Port Royal Sound, which didn't exist. It was the first connection of the Sea Islands to the mainland. And the advantage of that railroad is it brought coal to Port Royal Sound. So when the coal was delivered, the Navy followed.
In 1872, Robert Smalls was in the South Carolina legislature, and he pushed through a resolution to the Secretary of War calling for them to put a Navy station on Parris Island. And eventually he would go on to Congress, where he would continue his support for a Navy station here in the Beaufort-Port Royal area. They eventually opened a Navy station here and a coaling station.
They created in the 1890s on Parris Island the largest dry dock in the United States. This is the period when the U.S. Navy was switching from sail to steam. All the navies of the world needed a coaling station. This was the principal coaling station, because of the railroad, for the Caribbean and South American U.S. fleets.
This would be the biggest dry dock south of Norfolk. In fact, it is the only dry dock south of Norfolk, Virginia, that's capable of taking these new modern battleships and these new modern armored cruisers. So this becomes, at this point, a strategic Navy base in that it provides coal, and it provides top-line support to the ships, and they can repair the hulls of even the biggest ships in the U.S. Navy. Following the Civil War, national strategy and emphasis in the United States shifted to recovery from war, and all of our coastal fortifications went into neglect. The military was busy taming the West, and coastal defenses became something that was no longer important. In the rest of the world, technology is moving forward, and they're developing these battleships, they're developing new high-quality artillery, and this is going on worldwide. And in 1885, President Grover Cleveland appointed the Endicott Board. This was headed by Secretary of War Endicott, William Endicott, and the board would meet and issue a report in 1886, and they said that the conditions of our coastal defenses were just unbearable. They cannot be allowed to stay like that. And they made recommendations for fortification and improvements. They identified 29 places that needed fortifications, and 11 of which were critical. In that list of 29, Savannah and Charleston are on the list, but Beaufort is not on the list. It'll take international events to bring Beaufort into the play of modern fort technology.
So the USS Maine was here on patrol and in the harbor, and while they were in the harbor several times, they entertained the local population. So the merchants and the social leaders and the political leaders of Beaufort were invited to come have lunch with the captain of the ship, Captain Sigsbee. And the officers got to know the people got to know the officers. The crew, which was large, would go ashore on payday and make friends with everybody in town. So it was a very social arrangement between the towns, Port Royal and Beaufort, and the ship. So the Maine left here. It went and reprovisioned, it refueled in Key West, and then went the 90 miles across to Havana into the harbor and blew up.
This inflamed the already hot passions both in Cuba and here in the United States. At that point, somebody in the War Department realized that we had this big dry dock, the only dry dock in the South that could take on and repair these big capital ships that were in our Navy. We were going to start operations against a power in the Caribbean, and this fort was totally undefended. And that's what put Fort Fremont on the map. We had to have a fort here to defend the coaling station and especially this big dry dock, as well as this fine harbor that's here.
And of course, that event, which killed 300 or more sailors on the ship, was very much followed by the local news media and very much lamented by the many friends that the crew had made here. The destruction of the USS Maine was a personal matter to Beaufort and to Port Royal Sound. And of course, it was the Spanish-American War and the attempt to defend this harbor again, which led to the creation of Fort Fremont. The United States declared war on Spain in April 1898.
And by early May, we had temporary batteries in place here, submarine mines were in place, and in the summer they would actually place the mines across the Beaufort River behind me. The temporary batteries were a temporary expedient. They were located to my left about 1,000 yards. They immediately began construction of what would become Fort Fremont. The large batteries would house the large guns. Battery 4 Nance, the rapid-fire guns, the smaller battery, was completed by June of 1898.
In 1898, everybody in town went to war. They had a naval militia unit, South Carolina Naval Militia Unit, and they were absorbed by the Navy. Many of them ran tugboats from here to New York to Key West, which was the principal support base, Tampa and Key West, for the U.S. Army operations in Cuba.
Peace was declared by the end of 1898, and the remainder of Fort Fremont would not be finished until early 1899, and the first soldiers would arrive from the regular Army at that point in March 1899.
Well, Fort Fremont was named for Major General John Fremont. He was actually a local boy, so to speak. He was born and grew up in Savannah, Georgia, just south of us, and went to college in the College of Charleston, up just north of us in Charleston. He served in the Army, and primarily initially as a explorer, as Army forts were generally named for Army officers, and he was connected locally. This is more than likely why the fort was named for him.
The fort was constructed on a site directly across the river from the Parris Island Naval Station. And the site selected was 170 acres, which included the two artillery batteries. Fort Fremont, of course, had Battery Fornes and Battery Jessup. But then adjacent to the battery site was an administrative quadrangle, a very typical military type administrative square.
We are sitting in the number 3 gun position of a 3-gun battery, Battery Jessup, which had 3 10-inch disappearing carriage, large caliber guns, breech-loading guns. Their purpose was to engage the warships that might be entering the harbor and Port Royal Sound. We're here now at the 2nd battery that was part of Fort Fremont. This is Battery Fornance. Was named for Army officer that was actually killed during the Spanish-American War during the Battle of San Juan Hill. Battery Fornance mounted 2 British-made 4.72-inch Armstrong quick-fire guns. They were called quick-fire because they were loaded with a complete cartridge, and in time of action, they could fire 4 to 6 rounds per minute. The purpose of Battery Fornance was to defend the minefield, which was the other component of the Endicott Coast Artillery or Coast Defense System. A minefield with controlled mines, controlled meaning that they were connected electrically to shore and could be fired on command from shore. That control station would have been probably shared with the plotting room. And in order to protect the minefield, obviously an enemy would want to interfere with that, might send vessels, small ships in here at night to try to interfere, and this battery would take those vessels under fire if there was suspected that they were doing something to interfere with the mines, such as pulling up the cables and cutting those.
The Endicott era fort was a formidable technology. It represented state-of-the-art technology, defense technology of its time against the state-of-the-art threat, which would be the battleship.
The life for the soldiers at Fort Fremont was disciplined and regimented. They even had meal times were specified lengths of time, 15 minutes for lunch, 15 minutes at breakfast, 20 minutes at supper. They had to practice their skills. They were training and doing maintenance constantly. If you can imagine, with these big guns, they had to have skills and practice the skills in artillery, mine laying, signaling, which involved, in our case at Fort Fremont, the use of the fire control tower, which was a pretty sophisticated and advanced signaling technique. Then they also had to practice the typical military skills, marching and drilling, small arms fire, first aid, and so forth. In addition to that, they also had participated in athletics. They had physical training, PT, and they also had sports teams. So this was to keep them physically fit so that they could continue their duties, because it was pretty rigorous at Fort Fremont.
When eventually the decision was made to move the dry dock and the coaling station and the Navy station up to Charleston, then this fort no longer became significant. There was nothing left here that was to be protected. And at that point, 1911, the last troops were transferred out and the fort was closed.
In 1901, the mayor of Charleston and the United States Senator Pitchfork Ben Tillman from South Carolina wanted this to move from Beaufort County to Charleston County, because there are more votes in Charleston County, and the mayor wanted the U.S. Corps of Engineers and the Navy to dredge the harbor in Charleston, because battleships in those days required 26 feet of water. Charleston's natural harbor is 15 feet of water. Port Royal is 30 feet of water. In order for Charleston to sustain its port, its commercial port, it had to dredge the harbor. Well, if they could get the Navy up there, they get the Corps of Engineers to dredge the harbor. That was the play. And the play for Pitchfork Ben Tillman, the U.S. Senator in 1900, was that he'd get a whole lot more votes from the largest city in South Carolina. So it was a political, commercial operation, and they moved the nation, and it was done, boom, like that.
The fort did its job. It was a deterrent for anybody that wished to attack these. It provided protection. In fact, the whole Endicott system, although never challenged in this era here in the United States, provided some 300 major guns, coastal guns to protect major areas, and left the United States at the beginning of the 20th century with as well-defended coastline as any place in the world.
But I would just like to say that it's a magnificent artifact of an era. And it's an era that has been neglected. The turn of the 20th century, the naval station across the river here. And so it's a piece of history that's disappearing, and the Friends of Fort Fremont and Beaufort County have preserved it for the use of the public and as a memorial to that moment in history.
Fort Fremont closes a 350-year story of homeland security addressing European imperialism in the 19th century. It's a tale of how geography, technology, and national security creates a transition for America to become a global power. It's also a wonderful snapshot of America in the beginning of the 20th century. The Friends of Fort Fremont and Beaufort County have a valued partnership working in tandem to preserve the fort's integrity and promote the historical, natural, and cultural aspects of the fort. Most important, we are always looking for creative ways to enhance the visitor experience.
It's civilization versus nature's fury. Raging blizzards bury cities under thousands of tons of snow. Howling hurricanes tear apart coastal communities with wind and rain. And flash floods wipe entire towns off the face of the earth. As the skies clear, people begin to pick up the pieces. But after the storm, insidious damage is still being done. Our most vital natural resource is under assault, our nation's waters.
We're at the Chattahoochee Nature Center, and we're trying to find out what a watershed is. First victim. I need you to tell me what a watershed is. Do you have any idea?
Watershed? A watershed? Where people go to the bathroom? Sweating, I guess.
Something to do with sweating?
Uh-huh.
Like after you run, when you...
You perspire, yeah.
And then you shed it?
Uh-huh.
We wanted to ask you if you knew what a watershed was.
A watershed?
Yeah.
Is it kind of like the rain?
Do you know what a watershed is?
Shed that holds water.
Come here for a second. I want to ask you something. Do you know what a watershed is?
No. No.
Do you have any idea? What do you think it has something to do with?
I don't know.
What a watershed is?
Yeah.
That's just a drain pool, I guess you'd say, or the drain area. That's where the rainwater drains into the river.
Correct. That's a great answer.
A watershed is that area of land that drains to a body of water, be that if it's a river, a stream, the ocean, an estuary, a bay. Wherever you live drains to some water body, and you live in a watershed. So everyone lives in a watershed.
And in this modern industrial age, our water sources are becoming more contaminated with each passing year.
The biggest water quality problem that we have in the nation today is polluted runoff.
All water east of the Continental Divide drains to the Atlantic, while water west of the divide flows to the Pacific. And one drop of rain can cross many different watersheds along the way. As runoff flows into rivers, streams, and storm drains, the water picks up trash, dirt, bacteria, toxic chemicals, and fertilizers, creating a soup of pollutants that is extremely hazardous to the environment. And the consequences of polluted runoff exist worldwide.
The UN estimate is that there's about 1 billion people on the planet right now who don't have adequate access to fresh water.
97% of all water on Earth is salty ocean water. Of the remaining 3% that's fresh, over 2/3 is frozen in glaciers and polar ice. That leaves less than 1% of all the planet's water for our use.
I predict in the future that some of the U.S. water needs are going to come through pipeline because we have just overused our supply.
To address the complex threats facing U.S. water resources, the Environmental Protection Agency recommends adopting a watershed approach.
We're trying to reconnect some of the river.
It's a method that looks at each watershed for its own unique set of environmental challenges and solutions.
In many cases, people mistakenly identify large discharge pipes in the water as the problem. But that may not be the problem. It may be coming from agricultural runoff. It may be coming from stormwater runoff over parking lots and impervious surfaces. Every watershed is different, and you need to look at each watershed in its own terms and then think systematically about how you remediate, how you clean up that watershed.
In California, the Santa Monica Bay watershed drains a dangerous amount of polluted runoff after each storm.
When it rains, literally the whole residue of urban living ends up getting washed into the storm drain system and ends up going straight into the bay on Santa Monica Bay's beaches with no treatment whatsoever.
It's actually like a giant toilet flushing because all of the pollution, the dog mess has been building up and building up and building up. When it rains, it just flushes into the storm drain and goes directly into the surf.
In 1996, the Santa Monica Bay Restoration Commission proved there was a link between the contaminated runoff in the Santa Monica Bay and reports of illness afflicting people who swim there.
What we did find was at the outlets of storm drains, no matter where they were up and down the bay, if there was a flow of runoff into the surf zone, those people that were swimming in those areas definitely experienced higher incidences of illnesses.
The pollutants in the water affect surfers because we're actually the indicator species with all the pollutants. When we are in the waters, we're ingesting it through our skin and our mouth. Even if people don't take a swallow of water, it's still getting into our systems, our ears, any orifice in your body. And it causes infections, it can cause colds, sore throats at the very least.
I wouldn't want to swim in water that's got those diseases in there, just floating around, making more diseases.
I've seen it pretty much as bad as it can be. I've seen crap floating out in the water, literally.
Generically, we call it fecal coliform. More specifically, you might know of it as E. coli, salmonella, or enterococcus. Whatever's in poop.
There's times when it tastes funky, for sure.
Every day, the city and county of Los Angeles perform a battery of tests to keep the public informed about water quality in the Santa Monica Bay. Cesar Arzadan begins the monitoring process each morning by taking a series of coastline water samples. Then it's back to the lab for analysis.
Most of the bacteria that you're going to see, it comes from feces. And when you put it under the UV light, you're going to see a different kind of color. It's a fluorescent sign that there is a bacteria, and that one is called E. coli. That one definitely is feces from animals, or it could be humans also.
The results are reported to the health department, and beach warnings are posted as necessary.
The number of beach postings has decreased, and 85% of the beaches that have been monitored in California have received either A or B grades, and that's significantly different than 4 years ago.
But while progress is being made in California, the harmful effects of polluted runoff are a growing concern everywhere. So what can the average person do to help reduce pollution in our watersheds?
How you apply pesticides or not in your garden, how you wash your cars, making sure that you don't throw cigarette butts out onto the street.
Do not dump things on the ground, especially oils or any chemical pollutants. Pick up after your dogs. A lot of people don't realize how important that is. And just be a conscientious citizen and don't leave anything on the ground.
I think one person can make a difference, and it needs to make the difference. If not you, who?
Coming up.
We're heading for what's known as an ecosystem collapse.
Can the Gulf of Mexico be saved from polluted runoff? It was a flood of apocalyptic scale. 26,000 square miles of the lower Mississippi Valley inundated by water. More than 200 lives lost, and 600,000 people displaced from their homes. The flood of 1927 was the most disastrous in U.S. history, and its effects are still felt today. After the flood of 27, massive levees were put in place. And while they helped protect the lower Mississippi River basin from flooding, the levees and other human activities would ultimately harm the watershed in unforeseen ways. The Gulf state of Louisiana is the terminus of the Mississippi River. The mighty watershed that drains 41% of the area of the lower 48 states into the Gulf of Mexico.
We receive water from as far away as Montana, Michigan, to Pennsylvania, Ohio, Iowa. All those waters drain right past this area right here.
But by the time all that water enters the Gulf, it has accumulated enough contaminants from polluted runoff to create an enormous hypoxic zone, an area of water lacking in vital oxygen.
The size of the low oxygen zone in the Gulf of Mexico is about 9,000 square miles. That's equal to the size of the state of New Jersey.
The shortage of oxygen is killing fish and other sea life and could potentially have a devastating effect on the regional economy.
We are the largest navigation port in the United States. We are the second largest in the world. We have the largest fisheries in this country.
When we was crabbing, a lot of times all our crabs will be dead and we can't even sell them.
The reason hypoxia should be of concern to most citizens in this nation is because it's a sign. It's a sign of the degradation of our water resources.
We're heading for what's known as an ecosystem collapse.
If you're going to have an ecological disaster caused by the offshore hypoxic areas, then that absolutely translates into an economic disaster.
So what exactly is causing this dead zone in the Gulf? Hypoxia develops when an area of water receives excess pollutants, primarily an overabundance of nutrients, which produce large algae blooms that die off and lead to low oxygen. And since the Mississippi gets fed by tributaries that flow through 31 states, that adds up to a staggering volume of contaminated runoff.
You have drainage into the Gulf of Mexico from the Ohio River, the Mississippi River, and the Missouri River. Yet each of those three major river systems are watersheds in and of themselves with their own challenges and their own problems.
The Mississippi River has always delivered a lot of water, and that hasn't changed over the centuries. What's changed is the amount of nutrients in that water.
In fact, the Mississippi's nitrogen levels in the lower Mississippi River have tripled since the 1950s, and the growing hypoxic zone off the Louisiana coast contains the disturbing evidence.
It's like a rusty color, stinky, rotten looking. You see fish just swimming sideways, gasping for air and stuff like that. And when you pull up the nets, not one shrimp alive, all dead, orange. The fish, they rotten, like melting away and stuff like that. Can't breathe stuff, and it's just rotten.
This is just a fact of life, the way we treat our water systems, because we use them as our garbage dumps. We use them to dilute our pollutants and things like that, and it flows downstream. I believe the statistic is that if you're in New Orleans, the water that is going by you has passed through a human gut something like 3 or 4 times before it gets to you.
Incredibly, Louisiana boasts a natural resource that removes pollutants from the draining Mississippi, the once abundant wetlands.
Plants that grow in wetlands produce these wonderful filters for everything that is coming into them. They trap sediment, they tempt chemicals, and what leaves the wetlands is much, much cleaner water.
Wetlands also provide an important habitat for birds and other wildlife. Sadly, the Louisiana wetlands are quickly disappearing.
Coastal Louisiana has lost about 1.2 million acres of wetlands in the last 100 years.
When we levied off the Mississippi, it cut off the Mississippi River water from the marshes.
In addition to the levees, a network of man-made navigation channels is also compromising the wetlands by allowing salt water to seep into the marshes.
Once that salt water travels up these channels and overflows the banks of these channels out into freshwater systems, such as the cypress swamp, that salt water sits out there around the roots of these trees and kills them. They cannot survive salt water. They're freshwater plants.
Eliminating the hypoxic zone will take more than saving our wetlands. Reducing nutrient runoff in the Mississippi River watershed is the heart of the problem. It's an issue involving over half the states in the nation and a vast array of industries, particularly farming, which uses nitrogen-rich fertilizer to grow its crops.
Fertilizers are helping the United States produce the food for the world, but there is such a thing as overuse.
There are scientists who have done the analyses and predict that you could reduce fertilizers by about 12% without reducing crop production and see a significant decrease in the amount of nitrogen going into the Mississippi River.
Experts say the first key to changing behavior is raising public awareness.
We all live downstream of somebody, and we all live upstream of somebody. So what somebody else does in their watershed affects the water that I receive, and what I do in my watershed affects the water that somebody else receives downstream.
If we don't clean up our act, our water resources, which we simply cannot live without, will be ruined. Coming up, can the water supply for 9 million New Yorkers be saved from the ravages of polluted runoff? In January of 1996, one of the most devastating winter storms in history slams the East Coast. 2 feet of snow dumps on New York and throughout the Northeast Corridor. Schools, airports, and roads are shut down. By the time it's over, the blizzard and resultant flooding caused $3 billion in losses, and 187 lives are taken. And in the Catskill Mountains of upstate New York, the snowmelt triggers another potentially devastating crisis. Stormwater runoff, contaminated with trash, dirt, fertilizers, and pesticides from nearby farms and communities, threatens the fresh water supply. And the Catskill system of reservoirs is vitally important, for it is the biggest watershed of New York City, providing drinking water to over 9 million people.
The miracle of the city's water supply system is largely unknown to most New Yorkers. You ask people, where does the water come from? Often people shrug their shoulders and say New Jersey.
I figured that we were probably our own separate water system than from upstate. I'd rather be drinking water from upstate than the Hudson River.
I don't know that most people are aware of how large the problem is and how close to crisis many of our water supply systems are.
To preserve the purity of the reservoirs and enforce the Safe Drinking Water Act, the Environmental Protection Agency presented the Big Apple with 2 options. Either build and maintain a $6 billion facility to filter all of the city's tap water, or fund a $1 billion program to protect the watershed from polluted runoff.
When it comes to our investment in clean air and clean water, preserving open space, fixing antiquated sewage treatment plants, we can't wait. It doesn't get any less expensive, it gets more expensive.
With the historic Watershed Agreement of 1997, an unprecedented upstate-downstate partnership was forged to protect the New York City water supply.
The Watershed Agreement is saving New York City billions of dollars.
The plan includes purchasing and preserving 355,000 acres of undeveloped watershed land, the upgrading of sewage treatment plants, and the protection and restoration of stream corridors.
What we're looking at here is a main tributary of the Esopus Creek. During flooding, we were seeing a lot
We are out of executive session, and there are no matters arising out of executive session. But before we close, we have been informed that Mr. Greenway has asked for additional time for his public hearing to meet the law. Therefore, the public hearing that was scheduled for next Monday, the 28th, will not occur. It will occur at a future date as we advertise, so stay tuned for that. Is there any other action to come before council? Seeing none, we are adjourned.
David, are you going to talk to us?
Hey, Mark.